Welcome to those of you tuning in online now on YouTube for this virtual panel discussing the future of humanitarian response in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Particular welcome, of course, to the four speakers who will be participating in this virtual panel. For those of you who follow us on Twitter or who receive our email, you will have seen that in the past couple of days, I've had separate interviews with all four speakers, particularly discussing the response of their organizations to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we'll be talking more in detail about some of the issues that came up in those interviews. Welcome, Cecile, Kostas, Rafael, and Christina. I will actually introduce you in more detail in a moment. Perhaps to say a few words on the four topics that we'll go into more in detail. First, we will discuss the character and the scale of this crisis. To what degree is this COVID-19 pandemic forcing us to change the way of working, changing the thinking of our organizational models? Are we fit for purpose? Secondly, we'll go into the question on localization. As we all know, the localization agenda has been very much on the forefront of policy discussions, especially since the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain Agreement between donors and humanitarian organizations several years ago. Perhaps this COVID-19 pandemic is forcing us to make the last step in that agenda. But what does that mean exactly? This crisis is not just local, it's a global one. And how, especially when borders are closed, can we support local responders who are on the forefront of this crisis? So maybe the localization agenda presents opportunities, but there may also actually be some limitations when it comes to localization. So we'll discuss particularly those questions. Thirdly, we cannot avoid talking about funding, especially at a time when massive resources are going into national economies to respond to the public health and other consequences of this crisis. Needs will be reprioritized, budgets may be reallocated. At the same time, the needs that existed before COVID-19 will not go away, and new needs may emerge, just as we saw also the hurricane that hit Vanuatu the day before yesterday. So obviously, there are major challenges when it comes to the volume of humanitarian funding, certainly also for this year, of course, with COVID-19, but certainly also beyond 2020. When governments may prioritize our national economy. So what are the implications for overseas multilateral humanitarian aid as such? We don't have a crystal ball, but it would be good to discuss what we expect or what we think may happen with humanitarian funding and what we want to see happening actually. And lastly, the fourth topic we'll go into is the question on humanitarian coordination. UN working in a centralized system, the clusters and so on, either at the global level or at the national level. How does that actually relate to national responders? And how can we make sure that humanitarian coordination actually better helps us in our complementarity, so to speak, between international, national, and local organizations? So with that, that's a lot of, those are many things to talk about in the next 45, 50 minutes. I will introduce each of you very quickly. I think you're all well-known humanitarian leaders, but it might still be good to say a few words about your present job and what you have been doing in life. Cecile, I'll start with you. You're the Director for Policy, Strategy and Knowledge at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Before that, I think you have had this job for the last 2 years. Before that, you were with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and you're also an associate professor at the Fletcher School on Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So quite significant responsibilities. Great that you could be with us today. Rafael Gorgeu, the Deputy Director at Operations at MSF in Geneva, specifically responsible for advocacy and positioning. Rafael also has a long career in humanitarian response with various NGOs. Lastly, before coming back, I should say, to MSF, he was also the Director for Policy and Program at the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, ICFA. Thanks, Rafael, that you could be with us today. Christina Bennett is the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of the START Network. a network of more than 50 organizations that enables its members, both large international NGOs and many national and smaller organizations, to work in humanitarian crisis, particularly by providing them funding. And there's also a special COVID-19 fund that you have put in place just recently. Before actually coming to this position in September last year, you were the head of humanitarian policy group at ODI. And before that, you were, of course, with OCHA, the policy division as such. So, Christina, great you're there with us as well today. And lastly, Kostas Mosko-Koritis, I think I prefer Kostas, the Secretary General of Intersos, a medium-sized, perhaps I should say, Italian NGO that's been around since 1992. Kostas, you've been active, I saw, in humanitarian response since the mid-90s as well, in logistics, in operations, and then more recently, you have been, since 2015, you have been with Intersos, particularly as Secretary General. So with that, I'm ready to get into substance. Particularly wanted to start talking with you, discussing with you the question around the scale and the character of this crisis, because of course we easily say this is unprecedented. This is unprecedented, perhaps in modern times. At the same time, we're working in humanitarian organizations, so we are supposed to be relevant when it comes to unprecedented events. We're supposed to answer to unprecedented events as such. So perhaps other than this crisis being global and the fact that we're all stuck at our homes, so the travel limitations in place, actually, isn't it for us the normal thing to be ready for an unprecedented crisis such as this one? Cecile?
Thank you, Ed, and hello, colleagues. It's great to have this space to discuss what I see as very much an unprecedented crisis. Ed, to answer, yes, it's global, and it's clearly global, and at the same time, it's also clearly local. All of the responses are really taking place locally. The capacity to deploy internationally is extremely limited, so it's very local, and it's really putting a lot of demands on local actors. And at the same time, it's really absolutely universal. There is not one place of the world that is touched. That's one of the characteristics. Because it is so global, in a world where there is also global communication, we see an unprecedented amount of information and misinformation, which from a public health perspective is very damaging. So that's also really unprecedented, having so much misinformation and the challenges in managing that. I also think that one of the unprecedented characteristic is that we have all of the most vulnerable population everywhere in the world being really drastically impacted. So that's true in every country. Those most vulnerable, the people that are homeless, that lives in the most difficult, challenging circumstances, that includes, of course, a lot of migrants. All of those are really impacted, and that's everywhere around the world. So it extends really to places in conflict and in camps where the most vulnerable are impacted. Another thing that is unprecedented is the social crisis that we see with domestic violence because people are locked down. I mean, it is the first time that we have such a large amount of people that are in lockdown, which also really means that for some of them, they're prisoners in their own walls and at the hands of people that abuse them physically and emotionally. But maybe not to just be on a gloomy picture, one positive aspect is that it's also unprecedented in the fact that all of us are learning very fast, and we have to all learn and adjust very fast. And I think we're all doing it and being very agile. So maybe there is also something there, unprecedented, but more positive.
Christina, I saw you nodding. So what's unprecedented for the START network?
Hi, thanks very much. So as having spent 5 years at ODI, I was taught never to use the word unprecedented because actually, in many ways, we've seen this all before. If you think about scope and scale, you've got, not necessarily in this generation, but in past generations, you've got a crisis on the same scope and scale or on a smaller scope and scale than the Spanish flu, for example, or on the Black Death, things like that. But I think what's interesting and what's unprecedented about what we're dealing with today is that it's challenging our values as a society. It's challenging the very zeitgeists that we hold dear and the ones that drive our work as humanitarians, whether you're talking about globalization, the information age, the fourth industrial revolution, and the use of technology. And even our own personal choices in terms of the way we move and the rights that we expect and the freedoms we expect from our governments. And so what I think, looking at the positive side of all of this, I think what this crisis could do is force us to really think anew about the way that we regard ourselves and our position in society, and what kind of a society do we want out of this? Do we want to be a society based on evidence and truth, or one on disinformation and mistrust? Do we want to be a society that is about protecting our own, or about solidarity with one another? Do we want to think differently about social and economic rights, and about competition versus global connectedness? And while these are bigger, wider questions that we're all grappling with at home in our own societies, I think these are lessons or questions that we should be asking ourselves as humanitarians. What is our role in some of this rethinking of our societies? What is our role in fostering collaboration versus competition, solidarity versus protectionism, but also what is our new modesty? I think what this virus is playing out for all of us is that we can't, as human beings, can't control everything, that the world is much bigger than things that we can, that we have control over. And maybe this is a point where we have to think about our own modesty and our own humility in the same way that as humanitarians, maybe we have to think about our own humility and what our role is in crises across the world.
Rafael, I'm looking at you. Thanks for that, Christina. I'm looking at you in the sense of clearly MSF has a very particular model, which now is obviously with responding in 9 European countries, is also changing quite a bit in a way, or not actually. Is it not changing as such? What would you say about that?
About MSF operation, I think, as Cecily mentioned, we are all learning today. We are all learning on how to actually adjust the way we actually approach this kind of crisis. But if I may add just to as well build on what Christina was mentioning, if we look back a little bit how all this started, it started as an outbreak, okay, and it became a pandemic, which is spreading absolutely everywhere worldwide. I think this is, over the last century, the biggest one that the world has actually faced. From that, we're moving to a humanitarian crisis that will come. And then the question will be as well the role of humanitarian actors in this kind of situation. From that, we are moving to a social economical crisis as well. And an important point to look at as well is what's going to be the role of development actors, or big economic and financial actors here. In the WHS, the Grand Bargain and so on, we spoke a lot about this holistic approach. Actually, this will be a situation where such kind of approach will be absolutely needed. Everything cannot fall back, of course, on the shoulder of humanitarian actors. And the last point, as Christina mentioned, there was an after, there was a before, there's going to be an after. And the future is being shaped now. And I think there is as well a reflection to have on what kind of world we would like to have tomorrow, and how can we actually already engage in that. And now I'm putting back that in perspective with MSF. Of course, on our side, the first dimension is the actual response to the COVID epidemic as such. But then very quickly, we need as well to see that from a more broader perspective. Are we capable to maintain our own programs? How are we capable to reprioritize on vulnerable groups? And how are we capable to as well wait in the public debate about the future of societies, and especially for the future of international solidarity models?
Thanks, Kostas. How is this changing Intersol's model, which is also perhaps a little bit similar to MSF around working overseas? How particularly can you sort of support local actors or your teams that suddenly become, so to speak, local teams because they cannot travel anymore?
Yes, also from our side, I can say that it is an unprecedented crisis, first of all, also because it hits at the same time almost all countries in the world, including countries where we work usually as international NGOs, but also our own home countries. So I want to add that according to ILO, the COVID-19 crisis is expected to wipe out 6.7% of working hours globally in the second quarter of 2020, meaning 195 million full-time workers. So this clearly illustrates that from a health crisis, this crisis is becoming also clearly a social crisis. So how do we adapt ourselves? First of all, it is the first time that we had to intervene first in Italy and then outside Italy. And although we were operationally present in Italy, this was a game changer for us. Second, usually in a humanitarian crisis, the headquarters go to the field. We send more resources, human supplies, to support the operations there. This time, due to the massive restrictions, it is completely different. So all this in a context where things are changing every day. And using also, it has been said before me, that we have data that are not accurate. We are going to uncharted waters. So this again and again comes back to the essence of a humanitarian organization. So instead, planning is essential, planning is good, strategic plans are fine, but the humanitarian organization has to be agile and capable to adapt to the ever-changing context.
Right. I'm actually going back on these to Rafael particularly, because obviously we all agree that this crisis, and particularly the implications of it, are going to be long-term. This will be felt for a very long time. You're responding to the immediate consequences, perhaps, of this crisis, but actually what is needed is a much more long-term response. And I think, Rafael, you particularly spoke also when we spoke together in the interview around at some point we'll need to make choices between sort of the immediate needs and the longer-term needs, or the immediate needs related to COVID-19, and then sort of the existing needs that were also there before this crisis and that, have not gone away. So what does this mean in terms of prioritization, Rafael?
So I hope we won't end up at this situation. I really hope we're going to all be capable to address both short-term needs linked to COVID and as well other needs which are essential now, and as well looking at the longer-term picture. Today in MSF, we do not see yet a prioritization needed to be made based on needs. Nevertheless, we have to prioritize our operation today for one very simple and pragmatic reason: is capacity to send individual protective equipment to our staff and our health worker. And this is actually already a major limitation that we see in the current environment, is how do you manage as a health organization, as a health worker, to continue providing care if you cannot protect yourself? And if you cannot protect yourself, obviously you expose others. So coming back to your point, I don't see yet the need to prioritize or the necessity to prioritize according to needs. And I hope this won't happen. But I already see on MSF side the question of availability of supply, especially in terms of protective equipment, to actually decide what we can continue to run in a safe way for both our staff and our patients.
Christina, I think as part of the START network, you leave it to your members to decide together on how they allocate the funds that you make available as a network. How exactly does that work? And do you agree particularly that, at this stage, perhaps it's not about needs, but making sure that, well, obviously there are the safeguards for staff and so on, but at some point, obviously it may also become about needs, and particularly putting priorities. Is it the COVID-19? Is it existing needs related to armed conflict or whatever?
Yeah, no, thanks. So yeah, for us, we launched our COVID-19 fund last week. Over the weekend, we had a record number of alerts to the fund from our members all over the world. I think it was 86 alerts in 69 countries. And what we're doing now is going through those alerts And we are having to triage them because we only have at the moment 1.3 million pounds in the pot. We are fundraising like mad to make sure that we can top up that money and get the money out to organizations that are already organized, that have already raised alerts to us, that already know what they want to do in country, and we're a channel that can get that money out fast. So, the way that decision making works is that our members get together in country and decide collectively what the most pressing needs are in where they're operating, as well as who is best placed to operate where. So all of that decision making happens in a decentralized way. We at Start Network facilitate that, but we don't engage in the decision making ourselves directly. And so we hope that what these alerts mean are where the pockets of need are, as discussed with our members in the places where they work. Now, in order to, we've got the same problem of having only a finite number of resources to deal with and a finite capacity in order to get our members what they need at the right time. But we've made a decision very early on to separate the Start Fund COVID-19 from our regular Start Fund, and also to shore up our own capacity so we could keep those operations running in parallel. Because as you said, there was a cyclone in Vanuatu, we've got flooding in Yemen, we've got WFP putting 26 countries on a food insecurity alert because they're already food insecure, and COVID-19 is just going to aggravate that. So it's not that those ongoing needs are going to stop. So what we've tried to do is ring fence what we do in the Start Fund to protect the running of that fund as it normally would run, while running COVID-19 alongside it, and being able to get as much money out the door to members based on need as we can.
Thank you. I'm going to come back on the question, of course, of the availability of funds as such. Cecile, actually, I'm going to talk a little bit with you first around the question, particularly in localization. I mean, clearly, what for the movement as such, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, this distinction between what is global or international and local is embedded as such in the model of the movement. At the same time, yeah, your national societies as your members will look to you for resources, but they also will look to you for knowledge, expertise. There may be from Ebola that particularly you have developed certain knowledge and so on that may be relevant for this response. So is this crisis perhaps in that sense forcing us to make the last step in the localization agenda and really to put local actors on the forefront?
Thanks very much for this question, Ed. I don't know, and it's difficult for anyone to really predict where we will be going, but for the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, I mean, clearly is very well equipped to really respond to something that is a global crisis, but where the response is very local. That's probably not surprising for the IFRC because it was established 101 years ago exactly to deal with the Spanish influenza. So, it's something where indeed there is a lot of experience. What we see on the ground is that the response is very much domestic, and it's also very much a response that is coordinated by authorities in different countries. So for the national societies of the Red Cross or Red Crescent being an auxiliary to their authorities while abiding by the humanitarian principles and remaining independent and impartial is key in being part of being in a coordinating mechanism, etc. But the real strength of the national societies of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in a crisis like these ones is to be volunteers based. So it's really to have, almost 14 million volunteers in every country that are immediately mobilized because they are in their own communities. So one, there is no need to deploy people across the board, across borders. And that's really a strength. And that's probably something where we all have as a sector to learn. And two, they know their communities. Yes, they really not only speak the language, but the Italian Red Cross volunteers in Northern Italy know exactly who are the people that are the most vulnerable because they were already visiting them before COVID-19. And so yes, there is a lot to be said there, especially because this is a crisis that, as was mentioned by several colleagues and friends here, is something where we can't clearly say it's a health crisis that we can delineate from being a social crisis or a financial crisis or a protection crisis. It is all of that at the same time. So having that deep understanding of the communities in which the action is taking place is really key. But as you rightly pointed out, it's not enough to then be domestic. You also really, and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is well placed to then also have the global response. So bringing the expertise, including very specific medical expertise learned from places fighting Ebola in the DRC or other epidemics, and clearly the health expertise, but also the peer-to-peer learning. In fact, when the Chinese Red Cross started to be at the forefront, so before Italy, I mean, there was China, of course, and the Chinese Red Cross really started to be at the forefront of some of the response, not only in Wuhan, but also in other parts of China. And so what the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement was able to do was to really quickly capture those lessons learned by the Chinese Red Cross, and they informed the Italian Red Cross, the Spanish Red Cross, the British Red Cross, and now the Kenyan Red Cross and the Bangladeshi Red Crescent as they're responding. So that's key, and we really see that important. And then, of course, there is the other part of the movement, the International Committee of the Red Cross, that in conflict, but also in certain places which we've not mentioned yet, but detention facilities and other places where people are really, kept in situations where we really need to also address their own vulnerabilities and the way forward. So a long response to say that clearly we have to consider that localization is part of the response, but where we will be once we have passed this crisis, I don't know. I can't predict. I hope colleagues can do a better job than I do, but clearly we see that a lot of the response can only be local in this specific case.
Right, Raphael, I saw you raising your hand, so I'm going to move to you. My own feeling is that sometimes, well, you could say on the one hand, because of borders, the distinction between who is international and who is local is reinforced. At the same time, it gets more blurred because MSF finds itself operating suddenly in what one could call its backyard. So who is international, national, and local maybe not so clear anymore. And again, there may be both opportunities, perhaps also limitations. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually, I would like to bring two important points. We are talking about the global crisis, and as some of our colleagues here highlighted, the response needs to be localized, or at least it needs to be contextualized. We are talking about global public health measures, which are today being taken, especially around the population containment. But we need to be able as well to contextualize these kind of measures. The way some measures are being implemented in Switzerland, in France, for instance, might be actually kind of different if we implement them in some refugee camp in Dadaab, for instance, or in Tanzania. I don't have a specific answer to that. I think we are all kind of learning as well in this environment. But I wanted to highlight as well that these public health measures obviously can be a ground for limiting certain rights. This ethical framework to navigate that, but we need to be able to contextualize that and to see how actually we can articulate this tension between necessary public health measures, but the question of respecting the individual, avoiding discrimination, and of course avoiding politicization. This was the first point. The second point, if there is something that MSF, but I guess not only MSF, has learned through all the kind of outbreak we've been working on, it's the implication of the community. Trust of the community, autonomy of the community, dignity of the community. This is any kind of outbreak, and especially that one, will be addressed only by collective action. So it's not only about telling someone what you have to do. It's making sure that every one of us feel part of the response. And for that, we know that instead of putting pressure or using coercion, for instance, towards some community, what needs to be done is to ensure engagement of community in this response. And I believe that the debate around localization should pass as well, maybe first, by this kind of aspect.
Thanks for that. Kostas, I imagine that particularly you and your teams being concerned around protection issues and so on might also quickly run into questions around, well, the more sensitive issues, perhaps communities getting put in quarantine areas for other reasons, or for additional reasons, I should say, than COVID-19 and so on. So all sorts of ethical dilemmas and so on. Are you already seeing this? To what degree is this coming up, and what can you do about them?
As we said, it's a bit early days for to see the real extent of the COVID-19 crisis impact on the society, although it has started coming. I can use the example of Italy in this to tell you about how already excluded populations, they find themselves in worse situation due to the COVID-19. What about homeless people? What about the migrant seasonal workers in the agriculture in the south of Italy, working in conditions that are far from any decent conditions? So these vulnerabilities are exposed even more during the COVID-19 crisis. It's easy to do risk communication and tell people to stay at home when they don't have a home, or when they stay, the living conditions are horrible. Also as a result to certain policies from the years before. What about a camp in Greece, a refugee camp in Greece in Lesbos? So indeed, we see it. We see what was before wrong. We see it exacerbated today in our own home societies. So it is vital to be very sensible and sensitive. Very sensitive on this issue wherever we work, because exclusion that was existing before, it will be worse off today.
Cecile, I think it was you in the interview also spoke about the risk of stigmatization of, well, both actually people infected with the coronavirus, but also of health workers and perhaps humanitarian staff. What is it that you particularly learned from Ebola in that context that should be applied now?
It's something that that was just mentioned by Raphael and really several. In fact, it's the importance of community engagement. The importance for the people that are at the receiving end of the treatment to really understand that, you know, this is a treatment and this is not a place where they're going to be contaminated, and to really understand and be informed as much as possible in terms that are very familiar to them, to what are the risks and what are the opportunities. So community engagement is absolutely key. And so what we've learned in places like the DRC in dealing with Ebola and other pandemics and is really that, especially with infectious disease, there are a lot of misperceptions and there is a lot of misinformation. And the most effective factors for engaging with the communities is to have people from the community themselves inform, and especially people that are influential in the communities, that are leaders, being able to inform and participate to one, spreading the right information, and two, ensuring that misinformation is being addressed. And now that this is a global crisis, we have to really manage this and find the right balance between having information that is put on the global scene, while at the same time we are all learning about this virus, and there's a lot of scientific research that is only unfolding. So, but responding at the global level, while at the same time responding in words that are meaningful for local community. And it's only with that that we can really address the issues that we've seen in other places, such as attacks against health workers or health equipment or clinics, but also prevent them. We see in many contexts, I mean, obviously, being based in Switzerland, and it's the same in many neighboring countries, people stand up through their windows and clap and really just say, that the healthcare workers are the heroes. But we also know of a lot of incidents that are starting even in places where the majority of people clap on behalf of those health care workers, but there are also discrimination that is also starting, and fears. And really, it's all about containing fear and managing fear in this context.
Thanks. I'm going to move to the topic of funding. At the beginning of this discussion, I said, well, we cannot avoid not talking about it, because actually, obviously, it's a massive issue in relation to the immediate response, but also beyond this year, the implications for further humanitarian budgets and so on. Perhaps actually linking it to the question around localization and how international and local actors work together. Christina, I imagine there's a thin line between coordination and competition. How are you in the START network able to manage that line and avoid the competition for resources among your members in that sense? You're on mute, so you need to unmute. Sorry.
Thanks for that. Sorry about being on mute. I think what we're seeing in the early days of the humanitarian response to coronavirus in low-income countries, what I've seen is both the best of the humanitarian sector and the worst of the humanitarian sector when it comes to things like funding. On the one hand, we're seeing a lot of traditional humanitarian appeals, very reactive, very self-reflective, very individual in terms of what's being asked and by whom. And we're seeing, many donors also kind of defaulting to their usual partners to be able to fund through the channels that they know best. So that, I think is something that will have to change if everything that we've been saying on the panel comes to pass, and that responses have to be community-based and more local. But I think what I've also seen is the best of what this sector has to offer. We've seen huge amounts of solidarity and collaboration in START Network just in the last few days. Organizations, whether you're national or local or international, coming together in country to decide to collectively on priorities and needs. Of the 86 alerts we had over the weekend, 50 were pulled together by 3 or more organizations, and 26 by 6 or more START Network members. So each of these alerts, each of these packages of needs, of responses to needs, are the result of collaboration between organizations. So it does prove that if we remain focused on prioritization, on efficiency, on effectiveness, on who is best to do the job, we are actually great collaborators. So it's about incentivizing that kind of behavior, which this crisis may very well do just by its very nature. I think other trends that I hope to see as a result of us dealing with a new and uncharted territory here is that we learn to anticipate versus respond. Because we've done some research, and most 50% of humanitarian emergencies are actually predictable. So why are we still reactive? COVID-19, we've seen what this trajectory looks like in our home countries. It's going to be different everywhere, right? But we can sort of assess where we need to be putting our energies now in anticipation of it hitting these low-income countries, and not merely responding to it when it happens. And I think the other potentially positive impact of COVID-19 could be on this idea of flexibility, whether you're talking about the grand bargain or things that organizations have been asking for from donors for years. It's flexibility on the restrictions on funding, flexibility on the reporting on funding, flexibility on procurement and payment, and all of those things that has really been holding organizations back to be able to work in the most effective way. Donors are really starting to loosen those restrictions on all of us because they have to. And can this be an opportunity to really think whether those restrictions are necessary, and whether flexibility really can lead to better outcomes for people in coronavirus and beyond?
Thanks, Kostas. What does this look like for Intersos? I imagine you have a number of donors, either in the European Union or perhaps from UN agencies. What do you see in terms of flexible funding? And is there a risk? We're also receiving, in fact, some questions on the YouTube channel at the moment. Someone saying, in fact, there's a risk that, in fact, funding is too fragmented, leaving gaps and so on. So how are you able to manage the various funding streams and able actually to set your priorities in the way you want?
Yes. So we are in a crisis of a greatest magnitude. So things have to happen correctly, otherwise we will become irrelevant to the crisis. So the reality is pushing us towards directions, and most of the time they have to be correct, otherwise we will not get through this crisis. So speaking practically, there are ongoing projects which had to adapt to the reality, and there are coming new projects which will clearly answer to the COVID-19 pandemic. Flexibility is ongoing, is something that is happening now. All our projects that are on negotiation, let's say, phase, they are renegotiated according to the current reality. It's out of question to do business as usual today, although, and this is something that has been said already, but I would like to emphasize it, the old needs are still, the existing humanitarian needs are still existing. They didn't disappear with COVID. They can only get worse. So while it's important to have additional funds to react to the emergency, to the pandemic, it's vital to keep the old promises because all needs didn't finish. So all in all, it is true that there is a flexibility, there is a adaptive mode from donors as well to this crisis. But of course, it's everything now happening. So we will see better, we have a better picture in the coming days. So don't forget the old needs and let's answer with a relevant way to the new needs.
Rafael, obviously MSF's model for funding is very different from other organizations with a lot of discretion funding in terms of its private donors. I imagine discussions have already started in MSF in terms of expectations, what might happen to that source of income. We don't have a crystal ball. Could you say something about what certain expectations are and what you're trying already to do in anticipation? It might go bad, it might go good, I suppose. So anything you could share with us?
Besides saying I don't know indeed about what's going to be the future, let me just bring a few elements forward. Just so that MSF, we have the chance to have a very independent financial system. And every year we put aside a large amount of money only for emergency, which is available, literally available. So today, for us, answering to the current medical emergency is not financially a problem. Now, as I said initially, the restriction come more from supply perspective. Okay, the question will be obviously the impact either in a few months or in a few years. And this I really don't know. So as you can imagine, and I imagine as well that any leader in any organization is working out different scenarios, hoping to have in the coming period a bit more visibility to actually see what could be done and what to actually being able to prioritize according to the resources available and the resources that we can actually deploy at the field level. So I really hope that for MSF the future will not be as bad as some could expect, but more globally, I think for the entire aid community and not only the humanitarian sector, I still believe that financial commitment is a political choice. When you see how much money is being put in other kind of business, especially weapons, for instance, it's 100 or 1,000 times more than what is actually being injected in the humanitarian sectors. So I really hope there won't be this question of lack of money. I really hope that the question of global solidarity will be considered extremely seriously. Anyway, it is as well a key element of success to fight this pandemic. This virus is not going to stop at any border. So it's not because the situation might be slightly better in Europe that we should not actually be able to support other countries. This is, again, a global approach that needs to be considered here.
We're going sort of in the last 5 minutes of this discussion. I particularly wanted to get into the topic also of coordination there, and perhaps I could link it to finance, which is maybe not a good link, but still I make it because actually, Cecile, and I'm particularly looking here at you, you earlier pointed out very well that national societies, obviously in particular their local branches, are at the forefront of this response. You as federation, you put out an appeal on behalf of the movement, particularly appealing for, of course, for funding. At the same time, a number of these national societies also work with UN organizations. They receive also funding from UN agencies. I think there is this very bad term called implementing partners. At the same time, particularly your national society, your members, the national society is on the forefront of this response. So isn't this the moment to get rid of the term implementing partner and to actually think of a different way of expressing the way we work together as a humanitarian community?
Yes, it is really the time to come together. I mean, especially considering that the needs are so huge. And as was rightly mentioned, we have to be continuing to respond to the humanitarian needs that pre-existed the crisis, that are continuing when they are not usually being exacerbated by the crisis. We also have to then adjust and respond to everything that is COVID-19 related now and in the future, considering the fact that the most vulnerable are impacted everywhere. And then 3, there are also a lot of other crises that are ongoing. You mentioned Vanuatu earlier. I mean, we're starting, it's the start of the monsoon season. There will be, like they are every year, a number of disasters affecting populations that will be now even more vulnerable because of the circumstances in which they are. So it's hugely important to really see that we have so much needs and that even if we all pull together, we're probably not going to be able to respond to that. So the hope is that we could really have meaningful partnerships. And so in the sentence implementing partnerships, we really need to emphasize much more the partnerships and far less the implementation. And partnerships with local actors really means that the local actors have to be in the driving seats in terms of doing the needs assessment, and not simply just in fact be those that implement, but that assessing the needs, that assessing the modalities of what the response should be, and really we're not there. Clearly, there is a lot more that can be done. Yet at the same time, I think that that again the circumstances of this and the challenges that everyone is facing in moving across borders is also prompting us all to have to rethink how we do and how do we reach those that need to be reached. So I hope that can be the silver lining in the crisis, that we reinvent meaningful partnerships and respectful partnerships. So they have to be meaningful and especially respectful as well.
Christina, what's Start Network's model of way of working telling us or teaching us when it comes to working together between international and national organizations? Anything that can be learned from that, particularly for this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think what our model has always been about providing a space where a range, a diversity of organizations can come together and make decisions in a decentralized way and at the point of crisis. And so in many ways, COVID-19 is playing into that playbook, right? We need to be fast, we need to be community-based, and international organizations have to stand back. But I think what this offers us an opportunity to do, and something that we talk about at Start Network quite a bit, is we need to start valuing valuing local organizations for their contribution and not for their capacity. We always talk about the capacity of local organizations as extensions of ourselves, thus the term implementing partners, right? Is it now time to recognize that they contribute to a response in a valuable way, and that we equate that value with our own responses? we work differently, we're good at different things, and we need to recognize both of the strengths that we all bring to these responses as well as their limitations. When I was at ODI, we did a research project on capacity and complementarity, and we're really struck by the lack of self-awareness of international organizations who really didn't understand what their limitations were in any given context, and who really didn't sort of look to others to make up for the gaps in their own experience and their own ability to get things done. So I think it's time now to really reframe implementing capacity or implementing partnership as co-contribution, collaboration, partners, as others have been saying. And I can say that the START Network model of bringing everybody together sort of on those equal terms to make decisions together is something that has worked for us and hopefully will work for us throughout this crisis.
Thanks. Raphael, you want to add your voice to this in terms of working together and what might happen from this crisis as such in terms of new models?
Thank you for that, Ed. Working together, it would be completely non-responsible to do otherwise. It would be an ethical failure not to do to look for such kind of partnership. That's absolutely essential. I really hope that all of us are going to be able to move toward that. We can as well be concerned about some pushback in terms of more isolation of some countries, of some community, and so on. So that's absolutely essential. The other point I wanted to take the opportunity to make is that, as we said, this crisis is multidimensional. So it will involve a lot of different type of actors. And it won't only be humanitarian actors responding to this crisis. The question is really what's going to be the key role, the key added value of humanitarian actors. And I do believe that this will go through obviously responding to the emergency, especially the medical emergency. So this might be more for a medical organization. But it will be for all humanitarian actors to focus first on vulnerable and marginalized population. The population that are at risk of being excluded from either the COVID response or any kind of other response and exposed to political manipulation. And I do believe as well that humanitarian organizations have a role to play in upholding some key principles, such as obviously humanity and solidarity. And then coming back to your question, Ed, about looking forward, as we said at the beginning, the current period is actually shaping what the future will be. So a lot of different issues going to be discussed or even start to be discussed in the coming period. One of them would be for sure what is called the universal health coverage. So how anyone in the world could actually access affordable healthcare. And what I do hope is that this pandemic in the end will remind us of the importance of healthcare to all and for all settings. And we must keep in mind that collective healthcare, which is what the situation is about, can only be achieved by individual healthcare for all and in all settings for all kinds of people. So I really hope that trying to move from a difficult period, that this could actually open doors for a more interesting or more beneficial moment for especially the vulnerable population.
Cecile, I saw you nodding. We have a few minutes left. Wanted to add your voice to what Raphael said?
Sure, very happy to do so, because there are a number of things that really resonate, and in particular the multidimensional nature of what we are facing. This is really not a time where we can go back to our silos and to really think of humanitarian distinguished from development actors and really distinguished from social actors. The consequences of what we are seeing, and rightly there was a mention earlier of the ILO report that just came out, the international, the labor organization, indicating that we've lost already almost the equivalent of 195 million workers. So the social consequences will really be dramatic. And we really cannot see and just treat people and then just return to normal. I mean, it's absolutely something where we have to face the challenge and to really learn from this crisis and reinvent ourselves, not only as a humanitarian sectors, not only as international or local actors, but also more generally we initially had everyone celebrating the fact that we are traveling less, that there is less plane, that, you know, the positive impact of this crisis in reinventing new ways of meeting, like we are doing now, new way of avoiding traveling and deploying in different way. Can we in fact invent virtual humanitarian surge, building on the fact that in today's world there is so much health capacity existing in terms of expertise among individuals, you know, existing, and indeed, as Raphael was saying, build on a universal healthcare, and really just, you know, have a lot more solidarity and humanity, but also a lot more readiness to adjust and learn. I really hope that we can also live with that message of hope, and as we are constantly trying to do a perspective in what are the various scenarios that are there for us, that we also invest time individually and in each organization to really see what could be the silver linings and what are the areas in which we can learn from this and reinvent a much better, more effective, more socially responsible, more solidar, I mean, with a lot more solidarity, but also, again, respect for the environment, just to mention a few. So let's really learn from that and let's try to reinvent our way of working.
Thanks, especially for that word of hope. Kostas, anything that particularly Intersource already is seeing as perhaps a silver lining, or something that, you know, might come out as a positive from this response?
Yes, more than silver lining, I think that what should have been normal before, it has to be more normal today, that collaboration and complementarity between local and international organizations has to be the absolute normality. Second, the humanitarian coordination will need to be extremely strong and clear to deal with this response. Essentially, it needs to be as slim and agile as possible, but as robust as it needs to be. So it's important, coordination is important only if it can provide clear and timely direction and prioritization. So this is the urgency of today. And at the end of the day, as this pandemic affects our societies, not only in medical terms, we have to take in consideration that the response has to be global. We cannot let one country behind in the response. This is a really phenomenal test for the international cooperation.
Thank you. I'm going to thank you, all of you, actually, for this conversation. At the beginning, actually, we called it the Here, Now, and in the Future series, suggesting, in fact, that this might be a regular sort of event, an online panel. It's the first time that we have done it. Exactly, Cecile, as you said, this crisis is prompting us, all of us, to work in different ways and so on, and perhaps actually also even in better ways than before, in that sense. I'm going to thank you for now, really, for your participation in sharing your experiences and insights, and perhaps your expectations for the future. Good things will come out of this, but obviously the immediate future is very daunting. Massive tasks ahead. So I'm going to wish you from this side courage and good luck for your current jobs. I'm sure we'll stay in touch. I'm going to thank actually those of you who are on YouTube for having watched this debate. I think there has been a very good viewing from what I've heard. So thank you for your attention. As I said, we may do this more often in the future. I think it's sort of responding to an expression of being in this together. So thank you for your attention. And again, thanks to the four speakers in particular, Kostas, Christina, Cecile, and Raphael, for your time as participation, and good luck in your work and for your organizations. Bye-bye.